personally don't, it's on your opinion on abortion. I personally don't think that like I could have an abortion just because morally I feel like for myself it wouldn't be the right choice. But how do you defend your opinion as a white, well-off, religious man? How do you defend your, telling a woman what she can do with her body?
Because evil things are still evil, even if I'm a white, well-off religious man. And good things are still good, even if I'm a white, well-off religious man. So this is one of these. This is one of these identity politics points that I really, I don't mean to come down harshly on you, I don't, but it is a point that I really have serious moral qualms with. I think it's quite terrible. The reason being that the people who were fighting against enslavement of black people were a bunch of well-off white men for the most part. Right? And those people were saying this is a moral sin. This is a moral blot. They weren't living in the South. They didn't own plantations. They didn't live the lives of the plantation owners. They said this is evil and we are here to stop it. Right? When you see something that you think is morally wrong happening, especially when you're talking about the taking of a human life, like listen, I think that you shouldn't go around randomly killing homeless people. I just have this view. I'm not a homeless person. Most of the people who randomly kill homeless people are probably not of my economic strata, my religious view, or my I don't know whether they're of my skin color or not. I have no idea what the actual sociological breakdown of homeless killer serial murderers is. But I would suggest that my identity has nothing to do with what is right or wrong. And this is what Western civilization used to be about. Western civilization used to be about the idea that, yes, I'm not a woman in the healthcare field, but you and I can have a conversation about what's right and wrong because this is the nature of human reason. The nature of human reason, the nature of right and wrong is that you and I can talk about what's right and wrong and that I don't retreat into my identity. If we can all retreat into our identity and our morality is now centered around that identity, morality doesn't exist at all. We break down into a society of fragmented atoms where I can't even say, like, you're torturing a puppy in your backyard. I have nothing to say about that. I'm not a white woman who's in the healthcare field. I'm not going to do that. I refuse to surrender the idea that I can have a moral stance on issues that are of concern to society and of concern to the well-being of the United States simply because of the color of my skin or the nature of my genitalia. And honestly, I believe any view that feels differently is sexist, racist, and bigoted.
I don't see how you can claim that everyone is treating equally and no one is victimized on a systemic level when you have laws that punish one race that is more likely to use one type of drug more than another race when it's actually been shown that among kids our age, white people and suburban kids are more likely to use drugs in schools than black inner city kids.
Okay, so there's a lot there, and you're right, we disagree on everything. So, so to begin with, I don't believe in the concept of mass incarceration because that implies that the police are going into black communities with a lasso, rounding people up and taking them to jail for no reason. I don't think that's happening. Every person who is in jail has had a trial or a plea. The idea that people are just being grabbed and thrown into prison to keep alive some sort of prison industrial complex where the prison masters are the ones running the system, I don't see evidence of that. As far as the 1986 law, I think that it's important to put this into context. And the context is that that law was originally pressed by black legislators from inner cities who were sick of watching crack cocaine destroying their communities. And the reason for the disparity is because crack was more easily distributable and significantly more effective than powder cocaine. It is also the fact that the vast majority of people who are distributing and using crack cocaine were black. You know it's a drug that the vast majority of people who distribute and use are white? Crystal meth. Guess what the penalty is for 1 ounce of crystal meth versus 1 ounce of crack cocaine? They are identical. They are identical because they are easily distributed and they are distributed in similar forms. So the idea that this was just some sort of attempt to grab black people off the street and throw them in jail for no reason so we could have a permanent underclass of people with no fathers, this seems to me like a giant conspiracy theory with little evidence to support it. As far as the idea that these communities would be better if we just released people onto the streets, so I think it's important, again, to note the statistics here. The fact is the vast majority of people who are in jail for drug crimes are in for distribution, not merely for use. The idea that it's a black kid who's just smoking crack on the street who's getting picked up by the cops and thrown in jail, the justice system doesn't have time for that. Okay, the vast majority of even possessions that are pled down from distributions. Now, I've said earlier, I'm not in favor of the drug war. Okay, but I can tell you something. The people who are currently acting in criminal fashion in the drug war aren't going to be out acting as model citizens as a general rule. A lot of those people are going to be committing other crimes because this has been the history of the United States. When you make a substance illegal, the people who are criminals were criminals before and they're criminals after. Al Capone was not going to turn into a banker after Prohibition ended. And the same thing is true for a lot of the people who are committing criminal acts by distributing illicit substances. So I think that to pretend that the epidemic of single motherhood is going to end, all these guys are just going to decide, you know what, I've decided to marry that girl. I'm going to stay home and it's going to be like Leave It to Beaver. When they were dealing crack on the corner to 12-year-old kids the day before, I think that's a little bit of a myth.
how would you explain the amount of black people in jail currently?
Higher numbers of black people committing crimes.
Well, that's not the case.
It is absolutely the case.
Keep going. It's been statistically shown that white people use drugs just as much as
And
black
as I said, people are generally not arrested for using drugs. They're generally arrested for drug distribution in the drug war.
Do white people not distribute drugs?
Well, they don't in terms of proportionality with regard to, I mean, the idea that, again, you need to show me the statistics on drug distribution. So the burden is on you to prove the disparity, not on me to prove the non-disparity.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. You have consistently praised the free market as the most effective means by which to combat racism, sexism, etc., correct?
Yes.
Right? You believe legislation prohibiting such behaviors is essentially unneeded in today's day and age because you have faith that people, such as yourself, are conscious enough to fight discrimination in business where it can be shown, and at the end of the day, a business should be given immense freedom to conduct itself in the pursuit of profit. My question is as follows. If insurance companies can charge young males as a group higher prices for car insurance than young females, because the former has statistically been shown to be more reckless drivers, does this not leave open the possibility in a free market system for insurance companies to charge premiums based on certain ethnic or racial categories if these ethnic or racial categories statistically correlate with more reckless driving? If you object to the notion of charging someone more based on a factor that that person has virtually no agency in choosing, such as race or sex, why do you not condemn the fact that young men have to pay more? If you do not object to the possibility that a person of a certain sex, ethnic, or racial group may have to pay more on that basis, then are you not failing to disavow discriminatory business practice?
Okay, so that's a long paragraph, but I think what it really boils down to, the answer is that what you're now conflating ethnic racism with risk factors. Okay,
Right.
I don't conflate racism with risk factors, meaning if you are saying that insurance companies may use being black as a proxy for heart disease, for example, because black men suffer from heart disease at a higher rate than white men do of the same age once you hit a certain age, then my answer is that an insurance company is in the business of assessing risk, not in the business of assessing racism. So if they look at you and they say that this is a higher risk factor, I mean, another case, sickle cell anemia, right? There are certain diseases that actually do afflict races differently. Tay-Sachs affects Jews differently. So the answer is you're an insurance company. Of course you're going to charge more to somebody who has a higher risk factor. That's not racism. That's just the profit motive. I'm not saying that everyone's going to get charged the same in an insurance scheme. Of course not. I assume that you and I won't be charged the same. I'm older than you, presumably. They'll measure our bodily health. I don't know how much pot you smoke. Like, they'll make a bunch of distinctions, you know, and they'll make a bunch of decisions as to what our risk factors are and how that measures out in terms of what I need to pay in order to cover my projections. But that has nothing to do with quote-unquote discrimination. That's just a basic market decision.
Right.
That's actuarial,
Just for
actuarial decision.
clarification, so there was a study in which, I forgot what organization of the United States federal government did it, but Native Americans in Arizona were found to have, you know, to essentially be engaged in fatal car crashes at a higher rate than any other group.
Okay.
You think it's perfectly permissible for insurance companies to charge someone a surplus, just charge someone an extra premium by virtue of the fact that they are Native American in Arizona?
No, I think it's fair for an insurance company to charge someone based on the risk factor of driving. So what I would suggest is that in a free market system, and this is why I defend a free market system, let's say there was an insurance company who did what you're talking about. Right? And the insurance company decided Native Americans get charged more.
Okay.
There would be another insurance company that would come along and they would say, okay, is it really true that Native Americans universally are being charged more, or can I undercut my competitor by looking at people on an individual level and looking at all of their risk factors apart from race? Because race is not inherently linked to drunk driving.
But that hasn't happened with males. Because, for instance, not all males, you know, are going to be, in and of it themselves, like, more reckless drivers than females. However, like as you said, neither is that the case for,
but this is why, I mean, let's be real about this. This is why car insurance companies have good driver discounts, for example. They have good student discounts, right? They actually do look at more than you just, like my insurance rates went up through the ceiling when I got caught going down the I-5 at 113 and had my license suspended for a month. They've gone down since because I haven't had a ticket for 5 years. So, you know, this is, so the point that I'm making is that if you are suggesting that, if you're trying to line up discrimination with market-based profit, if your question is that, can you imagine a situation in which a business makes more money by discriminating, and would that be okay? Then the answer would be it's a business. You can do what you want in a free society, and I have no right to use your services. However, it has yet to come to my attention that racial discrimination in a business is an actual profitable thing over time in a free market system where people can compete, because race is not inherently connected to behavioral categories, right? The basis of racism is that race is connected to behavior.
Hi, Ben.
Howdy.
So unconscious bias is a concept well documented in psychological studies, which is basically that people associate negative things with people of color and positive things with whites. So if that is true, given that that is true, how does white privilege not exist?
Okay, so you're asking about unconscious bias. I apologize because it's kind of echoey, but the question was, if there is unconscious bias, just to repeat it so I'm making sure I get it right. If there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
The question is, given that there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
So number one, so when I speak about white privilege, yes, so when I speak about white privilege, I'm speaking specifically about behavior. Okay, there have been no studies, and really I've looked at these studies, the connection between what they call implicit bias, this is their favorite phrase now, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and biased behavior has yet to be proven at any level that is even remotely necessary to be used in, for example, a courtroom, which is why it's never been used in a courtroom. It is also true that there is no way, there really isn't, there's been no proven way to alleviate what they call unconscious bias, which means that we're ghost hunting. So what I would suggest is that if there is unconscious bias, and I'll acknowledge the possibility or the reality of unconscious bias, if there is, then I need you to I don't care about what's in people's heads so much as what they do. So if you point me to a racist behavior, don't worry, I'll let you respond. If you point me to a racist behavior, I'm happy to stand alongside you and protest it. What I can't do is protest about things in people's head that I don't know about because I'm not a mind reader.
Okay, so that's a really interesting response, and to that I have two questions. Firstly, what I've heard you say that this is something that, the way people think doesn't affect their behavior. So that's the first thing you've said. So I'm really curious if you can kind of give me another example of a thought that somebody has which doesn't affect their behavior. Like, do people who, support Trump not vote for him? Like, I'm very curious about that.
Yes.
And secondly, so the second thing that I want to ask is that if it's something it's hard to fix, does it mean we shouldn't do anything about it? Because you said, I don't know if we can change how people think. Does that mean we shouldn't try?
I mean, first of all, not a great impression. But beyond that, but my voice isn't that low. But beyond that, as far as the first question, which is, do people have thoughts that don't manifest in behavior? Yes, all the time.
For instance?
For instance, every thought that you have about walking up here and strangling me right now. I assume like we have thoughts all the time that don't manifest in behavior, and this is true every single day. We consider thoughts that cross our minds. And the problem with unconscious bias is the idea is you don't even know that you're having the thought, right? So how can you stop it if you don't even know that you're having it? But then we should be able to gauge the unconscious bias and its impact on behavior. That's why it's unconscious bias as opposed to conscious bias. The idea behind unconscious bias is that it's not even a ghost, it's a ghost of a ghost, because you don't even know you're having the thought. So people, the whole idea behind diversity training is the idea that you can retrain people to stop their chain of thought in order so that it doesn't manifest in behavior. I don't think that every thought manifests in behavior. If it did, then every time a man saw a good-looking woman walk down the street, a straight man saw a good-looking woman down the street, we'd have a real mess on our hands. So the second question, the idea was a little too broad for me to respond to, which is, just because something is tough, don't we have to face up to it? Yes, we have to face up to tough things all the time. And one of the tough things I would suggest that we face up to is that you have a lot more control over your own behavior and the decisions you make than the supposedly widespread unconscious bias of people you've never met.
As someone who is left-leaning, I truly believe in freedom of speech, and I think that is a principle that...
Well, thank you for coming.
All of... So my question was about abortion, and I just wanted to know, why exactly do you think a first trimester fetus has moral value?
Okay, so a first trimester fetus has moral value because whether you consider it a potential human life or a full-on human life, it has more value than just a cluster of cells. If left to its natural processes, it will grow into a baby. So the real question is, where do you draw the line? So you're going to draw the line at the heartbeat, because it's very hard to draw the line at the heartbeat. There are people who are adults who are alive because of a pacemaker. They need some sort of outside force generating their heartbeat. Okay, are you going to do it based on brain function? Okay, well, what about people who are in a coma? Should we just kill them? Right? The problem is, anytime you draw any line other than the inception of the child, you end up drawing a false line that can also be applied to people who are adults. So either human life has intrinsic value or it doesn't. I think we both agree that adult human life has intrinsic value. Can we start from that premise?
I believe that sentience is what gives something moral value, not necessarily being a human alone.
Okay, because, when you're asleep, can I stab you?
I'm still considered sentient when I'm asleep.
Okay, if you are in a coma from which you may awake, can I stab you?
Well then, no, I guess not.
I'm glad you answered that because I have no interest in actually murdering you.
But that's still potential sentience, and it's still a potential.
I agree. It is potential sentience. You know what else is potential sentience? Being a fetus.
The issue with that. The issue I have with that, though, is that if I'm in a coma and I'm not like doing anything to anyone, I'm not causing any issues amongst the world. Whereas an unwanted child may or may not be a burden to people.
Okay, well, there are lots of people who are unwanted, right? I mean, there are lots of people's parents who are unwanted, right? We're a bunch of college students. The problem is that now you're shifting the argument, right? Before you were making the argument based on the intrinsic value of a life based on sentience, and now you're talking about the level of burden that somebody presents as a separate moral argument. Okay, I don't believe that you being a burden on somebody is justification for them killing you, as a general rule.
I'll leave it at that, but I appreciate you and thank you.
No, thanks.
So I actually have two questions.
All right.
The first one is, how do you account for like statistical manipulation when you present your facts that you presented in the beginning? So more specifically, when you were talking about percentages of blacks in X, Y, and Z, and when you were talking about the differences in wages today versus 20 to 50 years ago, how do you account for A, the difference in population among blacks versus whites or other races, and B, how do you account for the increasing gap between the middle class and the upper class?
Okay, so, sorry, two things. There are two questions there. On any given statistic, I would bet we'd have a more productive conversation if I could actually give you the source. You could look up the source, and then you could ask specific questions about how those numbers were arrived at, because I'm giving you the bottom line, but I'm happy to give you the footnotes. I typically don't do that because it makes the speech even longer and more boring than it already is. But I'm more than happy to argue the stats and whether they're good or not, because it might be like that other guy questioning the Bureau of Justice Statistics stats. Right? There might be a flaw in the stat, and then we can argue about that. So that's a good question. The answer is we'll look at each individual stat and we'll determine whether we think that it's reflective of reality or not based on its internal logic. As far as the idea that how do I account for the gap between the upper class and the non-upper class, as I said, number one, it's not the same people in the upper class, right? People move up and down between classes fairly regularly in the United States. There is a widening gap in terms of the people who are earning the most and the people who are earning the least, but that's because if you had to make a chart, it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't look like the people at the top are going like that and people at the bottom are going like that. It would look like this, right? People at the bottom are moving up slightly and the people at the top are moving up rapidly. That's because investment income has done really well under the stock market, for example. So if you had money to put in the stock market, that's been doing really well for you over the past several years, which suggests that one of the ways that you get out of poverty is to save and then get into the stock market. Right? The point here is that when people focus on income inequality, I think that this is actually a rather large moral mistake. I think that focusing on poverty is a good thing to do. I think focusing on income inequality is not a good thing to do because there's no correlation between income inequality and relative rates of poverty. Right? There's tremendous income inequality in a lot of places on planet Earth. In fact, in all places on planet Earth. If you go to Sudan, there's going to be a rich warlord there, and then there are going to be a bunch of people living on $6 a year. Okay, that's a terrible place to live. Income inequality in the United States is also quite high, right? There are people who are Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and then there's the local checker at your grocery store. But if the local checker at your grocery store is getting richer, then it seems to me they have nothing particularly to complain about in how the economy is operating. They don't have a right to Jeff Bezos' money. They don't have a right to Bill Gates' money any more than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos has a right to their money. So the question shouldn't be relative rates of increase. The question should be, is your income increasing? Is your life getting better? Can you buy more cool stuff? And one of the problems I have with just measuring income by the pure dollar amount is that it doesn't actually measure what you can buy with those dollars. Right? The fact is that you can buy things today that you couldn't buy even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 or 20 years ago. Life is completely transformed. A poor person in the United States today is living better than a rich person was living in the United States in 1920. Right? Everybody has air conditioning, everybody has a microwave, everybody has a car, everybody has a TV or two. Right? All of these things did not exist. That's because the market has created new products for which there is demand. That does not mean that poverty has been completely solved, because I think it's going to be almost impossible to completely solve poverty, but it does mean that if you're complaining because people at the upper end are getting richer rather than because you're getting poorer, then you should look to whether you are operating on the basis of jealousy or whether you're operating on the basis of something that actually should matter.
Hey, Ben. So I'm definitely a left-leaning student, but I listen to your podcast every day.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So my question is about race and culture. So while I agree with you that when you look at white America, it's silly to say that the majority of white Americans are actively trying to prevent you from getting to where you want to be. I'm East Indian, and I have definitely experienced some racism, but I never felt as though it keeps Indians from succeeding. So I do think there's a cultural component that supersedes the color of your skin. But I also think that it's naive to say that it just so happens that the same minority groups that have been historically oppressed happen to have cultures that are less conducive to success. I believe that environment can create culture. Can you acknowledge the historical reasonings that led to these so-called unsuccessful cultures and not put blame on these minority groups? I know that in your heart, I don't think you're a racist person, but in my opinion, to blame people for their failure, for their cultural failures without taking into consideration historical, the history in general conceals a lack of empathy and sort of hints at racism.
Okay, so I'll fight back on the last point that there's anything to do with empathy or racism here, but I fully agree with you. Like 100, not like 90%, like 100%. I think that bad cultures are generally the result of bad things that have happened in the past or bad modes of thought that have prevailed over time. So, for example, there's a great book by Thomas Sowell called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that book essentially suggests that a lot of the pathologies that exist about single motherhood, for example, in the black community, or high rates of violence, are actually outgrowths of a slave and post-slave culture that was imposed by a white society that didn't bother with policing, that didn't care about inculcating morals or virtues in slaves. Obviously, they actually actively fought against it because they didn't want that to happen. And so there was an active fight from against assimilation by white people, and that created an underground culture that's really bad, and that exists in parts of white America, too. It exists in Appalachia. So yes, I think bad cultures have nothing to do with race. I don't think that just because, this is why I'm saying I don't know why it borders on racism to say the cultures are bad. Like, some cultures are bad, some cultures are good, and that has nothing to do with race. Charles Murray wrote an entire book called Coming Apart about pathologies in white communities that are really destructive. So bad cultures do arise very often from historical circumstances, including historical discrimination. What I say is that today, there's nothing preventing an individual from superseding the culture in which you grew up and making good decisions. In a free country, somebody's going to have to break this chain. Somebody's going to have to break this cycle. And so, am I going to? I don't care if you want to say that the pathologies that exist in the black community, black inner city community of high rates of single motherhood and violence, for example, or lack of institutional wealth, that is a result of historic racism. I'm fine with you saying that. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not talking about historical racism when I talk about white privilege. I'm talking about right now the idea that there's a superstructure of rules and laws that are preventing you from succeeding, or a culture that is trying to keep you down. I don't think that's the case. So the question becomes, if you are here, let's say that on average, the culture in white America, or with regard to single motherhood, to take an example, is here, right? Because there's less single motherhood in the white community than the black community. And in the black community, it's here because it's 70% single motherhood rate, and the white community is 40%. Okay, so the question is, before, thanks to racism and thanks to discrimination, there was a cap on the black community that was here, and they couldn't get past it. Okay, now the ceiling's been removed. So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful, and in fact I think it's actually quite hurtful, to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now.
As like an immigrant, a Muslim, fairly liberal person, I think this is probably the best event that I've been able to access, just because I'm not sitting in the audience and nodding for an hour.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I really do appreciate the platform for free dialogue. I think it's extremely important for there to be free speech so the good ideas sort of crowd out the bad ones. The reason I'm kind of here today is because, while I was sitting there, and I've noticed this in a lot of your videos, which I do spend some time watching.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Definitely entertaining, yeah. So like yesterday, right before coming here, or before I slept, I watched you on Piers Morgan talking about gun control. Mm-hmm. I heard you for an hour today, and I think what I realized is I think the first step is talking about free speech, and I think the left can definitely work on that. The second step is using solid, sound, evidence for your speech, so mm-hmm. that truly you have good ideas crowding out the bad. And I just wanted to take issue with a few things that you mentioned that I felt were a bit more sensational, a bit more, I know you're from like a lawyer background, so I can see.
No, go for it.
Yeah, so like you mentioned for rape on college campuses from 1995 to 2002 was the statistic you used.
Because those are the last available statistics from the DJS.
Sure. So yeah. There's current statistics that you think have, methods that are unjustified because it's self-identified, but that's contemporary, and you're looking at something that started 20 years ago, and then making up for the caveat that, okay, it's self-identified, so it might not actually reach that amount. So what I'm saying is clearly we don't have sound data on this, and maybe not all of the self-identified reports are justified, but using a statistic that's 20 years old, even if it's the most contemporary one that you have, is, I think, unsound in terms of academic.
So I agree with you. I'd like to have better statistics. Now let me ask you a question on that. Do you think that the rape rate in the United States on college campuses is closer to 6 in 1,000 or 250 in 1,000?
I definitely think it's somewhere in between, and I don't think I have.
No, but I mean, like, if you had to try and peg a number. I mean, I understand that I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to iterate. I'm not like a scientist or a statistician, and I don't claim to or posture to be, and I don't think you should either. If you don't have statistics,
Do you think that it has increased
no,
10,000%?
What I'm saying is, for you to criticize a certain community of using a statistic, 1 out of 5, as sensational or ridiculous,
because the people who actually created that statistic say that it's being misused.
Sure, and you're using a statistic that's 20 years old.
Because it's the best statistic available. Again, if you're willing to give me better statistics, I am more than willing to hear them.
No,
and as I've said, if you provide me new evidence, I'm more than willing to change my mind.
Fair, yeah. No, I mean, I don't think I have the political knowledge to debate that. So, like, just a couple things. So, moving forward, I think you talked about, I don't know, you said, like, you mentioned Jim Crow laws and slavery for what kind of pushed black people back, and you said, okay, this is in the past. Again, this is an example of taking the opposition's argument, making a caricature of it, and dropping it down real fast. Everyone knows about Jim Crow. Everyone knows about slavery. Not as many people know about, for example, redlining in Chicago in the 1960s that the CVL had to push out by 1964. These kinds of systems have been entrenched for years. I think most people have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on how this has developed a system of entrenchment for these communities. Even today, under Rahm Emanuel, who's a Democrat and I think is wrong, implements TIF increment financing that takes money out of western and southern Chicago and reappropriates them to places that don't really need it as much. Clearly there's a lack of funding. He closed 47 schools over the past years. What I'm basically trying to say is there's a lot of factors going on in these communities that are predominantly black, Hispanic, etc. And for you to simply say that, okay, Jim Crow happened 50 years ago, racism hasn't increased, is a bit, I think, again, insincere, because I don't believe that racism has, I do believe that racism has decreased, and, we're saying the N-word less, sure, but I don't think that racism at a systemic level has decreased, because the same communities that were affected in the 1960s, those people are still alive.
That's a wild accusation. I mean, I'm with you all the way up till the end. When you say there's a lot of complexity to these arguments, I agree. There's a lot of complexity to these arguments. Yeah, I'll tell you where there is no complexity, and that is the only way you are going to get out of the current problems that you are in is by relying on yourself to make good decisions. That's not to say that there aren't obstacles, and if there are obstacles that you can name, I'm more than happy to stand there and fight them with you. If you can show me evidence of redlining by a bank in which a black person and a white person are being treated unequally with exactly the same application, I will stand next to you and root for them to be prosecuted in court, because that's illegal under the Civil Rights Act. But if you're going to suggest that racism has not decreased over the last 50 years, it's just sort of hidden, there is no evidence to suggest that whatsoever.
Sorry, I might have misspoke. So, I agree with you. That was my bad. I don't think racism has increased. It's absolutely decreased. But I think that the institutions that existed 50 years ago haven't really vanished. The title character of the Atlantic story, Clyde Ross, I went to his house. He is experiencing the same things that he experienced 50 years ago. The government will come by. And I know you say that the government shouldn't fix this, and I agree. I'm just saying the government shouldn't make it worse. The government comes by. They say, hey, we're providing subsidies for these communities to become better. You can use it for paint for your house, better windows, anything that the public can see to make it look better. But he doesn't have heating in his house, but he can't use it for that because that's just not the system that's in place.
Right.
All I'm saying is
the government sucks, yeah.
But I totally agree with you on that. But all I'm trying to say is,
so come to the dark side.
Yeah, I guess all I'm trying to say is I definitely agree that these are complicated. I think the left and the right, they take small points and they sensationalize them to create a political platform. I would just appreciate it, since you are a journalist and not a politician, to do the same kind of due diligence when you really offer input, because a lot of people listen to you, a lot of people respect your opinion.
Well, okay, so again, the article that you're citing by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I haven't actually read that article, so I'm not going to claim knowledge of an article that you've read and I haven't. So I'll take your account of the situation for what it is, which is there's some guy who is apparently being victimized by the government because the government will only give him subsidies for X, Y, and Z, but he actually wants it for A, B, and C. My answer to that is that it's not the government's job to provide subsidies for anyone. And if the government is mal-appropriating subsidies, I object to that regardless of the race of the person. I object to subsidies to the ethanol boondoggle in Iowa, which is basically white people. I object to subsidies to Wall Street. I object to all these subsidies. I don't think the government should be involved at all. And this fellow who was victim, to pretend that systematized discrimination under Jim Crow that was happening in 1960 is the same as a badly run government program in 2017 because they want to give you money for your windows but not for your water heater. Again, I don't see the relationship between the two, and to suggest that the banks are operating in the same way now as they were operating in 1960, I don't see the evidence for that either. I'm happy to look at evidence, but I need actual evidence. I can't just base it on headlines.
Connor, I was just wondering, I agree with you that like biologically a man is a man and a woman is a woman. I was just wondering what you see the detriment of society, like why we can't like let a transgender like woman be called she or something.
Because it is a lie.
I agree.
Detrimental to society. So I think there are a couple of reasons. So yeah, sorry, you let him finish the question. That's fine.
No, I'm just wondering, what do you see? I understand it's lying. Like I was taught not to lie. I just don't understand what is so wrong about that specific lie.
Well, I mean, as opposed to other lies, I'm not sure there is anything wrong. I mean, I don't like all of them. But as far as that specific lie, I think that one of the problems that we have is this determination that men can become women and women can become men undermines some barriers between men and women that I think are useful and good, particularly in children. So if I have to teach my 3.5-year-old, right, she's almost 4, if I teach my almost 4-year-old girl that she can become a boy, then I think that is not only lying to her, I think it's confusing her, and I think it's damaging to her psyche. One of the premises of the transgender movement is that human minds are completely non-malleable. That oddly enough, men are not men and women are not women, but if you are transgender, that is unchangeable, and that especially among children, if a 3 or 4-year-old has certain feelings, those feelings have to be taken completely seriously. We can't fight against them. We can't suggest that the kid will grow out of it. Instead, we have to say that this kid is inherently transgender. I can tell you, having kids are incredibly malleable. Kids are easily confused. And saying to a child, which is what the transgender movement would like to do, I mean, they're having drag shows in kindergarten now in some areas. When you do that, when you confuse kids about gender, you're doing the kids no favors. You're doing them or you could be doing significant damage to kids. Kids should not be confused about their biology. Kids should not be confused about their gender. And let's put it this way, just from a certain statistical standpoint, if it is true that the transgender suicide attempt rate is 40% over the lifetime, and if I am right, then more kids will be confused about gender, which, by the way, you do see. You've seen an uptick in transgender surgery in Europe. You've seen a greater identification as transgender overall in places like Europe, malleable rates of transgenderism in Europe. If that's the case, then you're raising the suicide rates, presumably, if there's an association between for young people who are now confused about gender. So I'm not in the mood for countenancing lies about what men and women are, specifically when I think that there is a goal of redefining a key term for the entire society.
Hi.
Howdy.
Fact number 1, transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychologists Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number 2, rich kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor.
It's not true.
Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where your
is there a
life
question
will
mark at
end
the
up.
end?
Fact number 3, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the 3 facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number two. Number three, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
You can call me out on being a liberal snowflake or whatever
No, it's fine.
about my feelings. But then you, in the middle of your speech, I think this was hate speech. You made fun of transgenders. Well,
I made fun of one person who grabbed me by the back of the neck and threatened me with violence, to be fair.
I mean, yes, but also Caitlyn Jenner. And you seem to be making, no. I don't want, no. You made it, you were clearly making jokes at the expense of transgender people. So my question is, where do you draw the line between being a mensch and clearly offending people? Like, where do you draw the line?
Okay, so for me, so for me, if I coldly and clearly state a fact and you're offended by the fact, that's not me being responsible for offending you. That's me saying a fact and you being offended. As far as me making jokes about Zoe Tur, my general rule is that if somebody grabs me by the back of the neck and threatens me with violence on national television, I have the right to make fun of them. That's just as when I was at University of Wisconsin,
okay,
if people are going to chant at me and yell at me, then I'm not going to treat them with courtesy because they are not deserving of courtesy. Courtesy is something that you earn by being courteous.
Okay, fine. I understand that, but it just seems a little bit hypocritical to brag about the fact that you openly humiliated someone on national television while also telling people to be mensches. I just think that's a little.
Well, I mean, let's put it this way: my belief is in mutually assured destruction. So if you're going to, if you attempt to again do me physical harm on national TV, then I'm not going to treat you with a level of respect that you have not earned. That's. I mean, I'm treating you with respect, and we disagree, right? Because you're courteous. So thank you for that.